Imagine for a moment that the key to understanding autism and related conditions doesn't lie in the modern era, but in our evolutionary past. What if the differences we see in how some people think, sense, and experience the world are the result of genetic codes quietly passed down through generations? Codes from an ancient cousin of ours, the Neanderthals. This is the hypothesis I want to share today. As an autistic man, I've been investigating the connections between neurodivergence, genetics, and the human body. I believe a specific set of genes inherited from Neanderthals may be the uniting factor behind a wide spectrum of traits we associate with autism and conditions like Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome and Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia Syndrome, POTS. But before I dive into the what-ifs, I want to be clear. This is not about proving a radical idea to be absolutely correct. It's about opening up a new way of thinking. It's about asking questions that might spark something in you, whether you're neurodivergent, a scientist, or just someone curious about how ancient history connects to today. Neanderthals, or Neanderthals if you prefer. For decades, we've pictured them as strong, muscular beings built to survive harsh Ice Age conditions. But what if we've been wrong about that? What if the assumption that their bodies were simply larger, denser versions of ours is missing something? Here's the twist. We know Neanderthals had much bigger brains than modern humans. No disputes there. But here's the question that sets us on a new path. How did their bodies support those brains? Growing and powering such large brains requires specific biological adaptations. One major factor I propose is connective tissue, the stuff that holds everything together, our muscles, bones, nerves, and organs. The human body has 4 basic types of tissue: epithelial, muscle, nervous, and connective tissue. Connective tissue glues it all together, creating the structure those cells develop on. We've long assumed Neanderthal connective tissue was like ours. That's why scientists concluded that the oversized attachment points on Neanderthal skeletons must have meant serious muscle mass. If their connective tissue worked like Homo sapiens, but what if it was more like the connective tissue seen in people with Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, or EDS? People with EDS have more elastic, stretchy connective tissue. Their ligaments and tendons are more flexible, affecting everything from posture to joint mobility to how their bodies handle blood pressure. What if Neanderthals had connective tissue like this? If Neanderthals had more elastic connective tissue, it changes how we understand their entire body structure. No longer are they just stocky and muscular. They might have been more adaptable, flexible, and agile than we've imagined. Now we need to ask, what would happen if these Neanderthal connective tissue genes were passed down to modern humans? We know everyone outside Africa has between 1% and 2% Neanderthal DNA, and some Neanderthal genes are still active in us today, affecting things like hair color, immune function, and metabolism. But what if some of these genes also affect our connective tissue? Imagine that a small but important piece of Neanderthal code related to connective tissue gets switched on in some people. The connective tissue in these individuals is just slightly different from the norm, but that small difference sets off a cascade of effects. Think of it like building a car with steel that's 0.0871 millimeters thick instead of 0.087 millimeters. The car would look the same and drive mostly the same, perhaps, but over time you'd start noticing subtle differences. The car's performance would change depending on how it's driven, maintained, and understood by the driver. A tiny change in material can ripple through every system. The car would be heavier, so it would take a longer distance to stop. But the ABS system wouldn't know that because it assumes how things are supposed to be. It would corner different. It would steer different. The sensors would be a little bit further apart with a slightly thicker steel. So imagine that kind of change scaled up to an airplane, or a skyscraper, or the human body. The human brain and spinal cord are encased in connective tissue. Nerves are supported by it. If the connective tissue is more elastic or different in some way, it can impact how signals travel through the body. It might change how a person experiences sensations, how they perceive sound, light, touch, and so on. It could make a person more sensitive to sensory input, something we often see in autistic people. If your connective tissue recipe makes a home for a neuron 1 or 2 cells more often than someone else's, your nervous system is going to get a lot more wiring and a lot more data flowing. This theory could also explain why many autistic individuals experience autonomic dysfunction, such as POTS. In POTS, the body struggles to regulate heart rate and blood pressure, especially when standing up. Often, this is linked to differences in connective tissue. If the tissues that support blood vessels are too elastic, blood pools in the lower extremities, and the heart has to work overtime to compensate. This overcorrection causes the body to swing between extremes, leading to the symptoms POTS patients report. What's fascinating is that POTS and EDS are frequently comorbid with autism. Could it be that all these conditions share a common root in Neanderthal-derived connective tissue? Let's take this idea further. We know autism exists on a spectrum. It's not a linear gradient, but a spectrum. Not everyone has all the symptoms all the time. Some traits are barely noticeable. Some individuals don't speak or have significant physical impairments. But what if those traits, whether mild or severe, are simply different expressions of the same underlying genetic difference, unfolding differently as each of us develops? This theory offers a unified explanation for what researchers call the broader autism phenotype, a range of traits seen not only in autistic people, but also in their non-autistic relatives. These traits could all stem from Neanderthal genes influencing connective tissue, which in turn impacts the nervous system. And speaking of recipes, autistic individuals often have specific food preferences that seem unusual or even disordered. What if these preferences are echoes of an ancient Neanderthal diet optimized to fuel their larger brains? No, Neanderthals didn't have chicken nuggets, French fries, and buttered pasta. But for a body building with this collagen recipe, it's not strange to think they'll be picky about what they want to eat. Similarly, many autistic people experience gut problems, often linked to sensory sensitivities or differences in interoception, the sense of internal body states. Could these gut issues stem from differences in the connective tissue that supports the nerves that run through the digestive system? The gut is regarded as our second brain, but I believe we're way behind on understanding it, especially in autistic people. If we follow this line of thinking, we start to see how all of these traits, autism, EDS, POTS, gut issues, aren't separate disorders, but part of a continuum of human variation. And that variation may have ancient roots in our evolutionary past. But this is where things get tricky. If we start talking about autism and related conditions as a product of Neanderthal genetics, we need to be careful. Populations displaying differences, neurological, physical, or cultural, have pretty much always ended up marginalized or persecuted. We are a prime example. Autistic people already make up a significant portion of the prison population and face a shortened life expectancy. It's dangerous to stand up and stand out. But this theory brings so many of us together under a unifying umbrella in harmony with the rest of humanity that I'm hopeful it can be a force for good. We need to be inclusive in how we frame this theory. It's time to rethink the language we use. If these traits are part of human diversity, then terms like disorder, syndrome, and pathology don't make sense. Maybe it's time to adopt new terms that reflect the biological and cultural significance of these differences. Let's do better. I am not a pile of disorders and syndromes with names and insurance codes. I'm one person, built differently. I call it autistic today, but that word isn't enough. I'm not a geneticist, and I don't expect this hypothesis to be proven right without a lot of debate and research. But I believe this line of thinking can spark something new in how we approach the study of autism and neurodiversity. It calls for more interdisciplinary research, where specialists in genetics, anthropology, neurology, and autism research come together to swap notes and build a broader understanding of how ancient genes might still be influencing us today. If this hypothesis is correct, it could change not just how we treat these conditions, but how we view them entirely. Instead of trying to fix autism traits or view them as defects, we might start seeing them as part of a long-standing human legacy, one that's deeply connected to our evolutionary history. That's a shift that could have profound implications for how we understand neurodivergence, human variation, and our shared genetic past. So, while this theory may be proven wrong, possibly within minutes of posting, I hope it sparks a deeper conversation, because even if we don't have all the answers yet, the pursuit of those answers will give us a richer, more inclusive understanding of who we are. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. I just want to remind everyone that there's a companion video to this one where I dive into the more speculative nature of this theory and address some potential criticisms head on. If you're curious about the nitty-gritty details or just want to hear more about where I'm coming from, check it out. And hey, if you've got questions, thoughts, or you just want to talk about this more, hit me up. I'm on YouTube as Scott the Media Hoarder, and you can find me on Reddit as Big Ass Superstar. I'm always up for a good conversation. It's not true. I hardly ever get back to people. But there's a lot more to share about this if you're interested. Let's keep exploring this together. All right, that's it for now. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.